Part 8. With the Red Army. 1. The Real Red Army. After 2 weeks of hacking and walking over the hills and plains of Gansu and Ningxia, I came to Yuwangbao, a walled town in southern Ningxia, which was then the headquarters of the First Front Red Army, and of its commander-in-chief, Peng Dehuai. Although in a strict military sense all Red Warriors might be called irregulars, and some people would say highly irregulars, the Reds themselves made a sharp distinction between their front armies, independent armies, partisans, and peasant guards. During my first brief travels in Shanxi, I had not seen any of the regular Red Army, for its main forces were then moving in the west, nearly 200 miles from Bao'an. I had planned a trip to the front, but news that Chiang Kai-shek was preparing to launch another major offensive from the south had inclined me towards the better part of valor, and an early departure while I could still get past the lines to write my story. On day 1 I had expressed these doubts to Wu Liangbing, the young Soviet official who had acted as interpreter in my long official interviews with Mao Zedong. He had been dumbfounded. "You have a chance to go to the front, and you wonder whether you should take it? Don't make such a mistake. Chiang Kai-shek has been trying to destroy us for 10 years, and he's not going to succeed now. You can't go back without seeing the real Red Army." He had produced evidence to show why I shouldn't, and it was well that I took his advice. Perhaps the best way to approach an understanding of these so-called bandits was statistical. The facts assembled below were furnished from his files by Yang Shangkun, the Russian-speaking 29-year-old chairman of the political department of the First Front Red Army. With a few exceptions, this statistical report is confined to matters which I had some opportunity to verify by observation. First of all, many people suppose the Reds to be a hard-bitten lot of outlaws and malcontents. I vaguely had some such notion myself. I soon discovered that the great mass of the Red soldiery was made up of young peasants and workers who believed themselves to be fighting for their homes, their land, and their country. According to Yang, the average age of the rank and file was 19. Although many men with the Reds had fought for 7 or 8 or even 10 years, they were balanced by a vast number of youths still in their middle teens, and even most of the old Bolsheviks, veterans of many battles, were only now in their early 20s. The majority had joined the Reds as young vanguards or enlisted at the age of 15 or 16. In the First Front Army, a total of 38% of the men came from either the agrarian working class, including craftsmen, muleteers, apprentices, farm labourers, etc., or from the industrial working class, while 58% came from the peasantry. Only 4% were from the petty bourgeois, sons of merchants, intellectuals, small landlords, and such. In this army, over 50% of the troops, including commanders, were members of the Communist Party or the Communist Youth League. Between 60 and 70% of the soldiers were literate, that is, they could write simple letters and texts, posters, handbills, etc. This was much higher than the average among ordinary troops in the White Districts, and it was very much higher than the average in the peasantry of the Northwest. Red soldiers began to study characters in red texts, specially prepared for them, from the day of their enlistment. Prizes were offered, cheap notebooks, pencils, tassels, etc., much valued by the soldiers, for rapid progress, and a great effort was made to stimulate the spirit and ambition and competition. Red soldiers, like their commanders, received no regular salaries, but every enlisted man was entitled to his portion of land, and some income from it. This was tilled in his absence either by his family or by his local Soviet. If he was not a native of the Soviet districts, however, his remuneration came from a share in the proceeds of crops from public lands, confiscated from the great landlords, which also helped provision the Red Army. Public lands were tilled by villagers in the local Soviets. Such free labour was obligatory, but the majority of the peasants, having benefited in the land redistribution, may have cooperated willingly enough to defend a system that had bettered their livelihood. The average age of the officers in the Red Army was 24. This included squad leaders and all officers up to army commanders, but despite their youth, these men had behind them an average of 8 years of fighting experience. All company commanders or higher were literate, though I met several who had not learned to read and write till after they had entered the Red Army. About a third of the Red commanders were former Kuomintang soldiers. Among Red commanders were many graduates of Huangpu Academy, graduates of the Red Army Academy in Moscow, former officers of Jiang Xueliang's Northern Army, cadets of the Baoding Military Academy, former Guomingjun men, which was the Christian general Feng Yuxiang's army, and a number of returned students from France, Soviet Russia, Germany, and England. I met only one returned student from America. The Reds did not call themselves Bing, or soldiers, a word to which much odium was attached in China, but Janshi, which means fighters or warriors. The majority of the soldiers as well as officers of the Red Army were unmarried. Many of them were divorced, that is, they had left their wives and families behind them. In several cases I had serious suspicions that the desire for this kind of divorce, in fact, might have had something to do with their joining the army, but this may be a cynical opinion. My impression from sources of conversations on the road and at the front was that most of these Red fighters were still virgins. There were few communist women at the front with the army, and there were nearly all Soviet functionaries in their own right or married to Soviet officials. As far as I could see or learn, the Reds treated the peasant women and the girls with respect, and the peasantry seemed to have a good opinion of Red Army morality. I heard no cases of rape or abuse of the peasant women, though I heard from some of the southern soldiers of sweethearts left behind them. There was no law against fornication, but any Red Army man who got into difficulties with a girl was expected to marry her. As men far outnumbered women here, the opportunities were few. I saw nothing going on that looked like promiscuity. The Red Army was puritanical in its views on sexual license, and a vigorous daily routine kept the young troops occupied. Very few of the Reds smoked or drank. Abstention was one of the 8 disciplines of the Red Army, and although no special punishment was provided for either vice, I read in the black column of wall newspapers several grave criticisms of habitual smokers. Drinking was not forbidden, but drunkenness was unheard of. Commander Peng Dehuai, who had been a Kuomintang general, told me that the extreme youth of the Red Army explained much of its capacity to withstand hardship, and that was quite believable. It also made the problem of feminine companionship less poignant. Peng himself had not seen his own wife since 1928, when he led an uprising of Kuomintang troops and joined the Reds. Casualties among Red Army commanders was very high. They customarily went into battle side by side with their men, from regimental commanders down. Joseph Stilwell once said to me that one thing alone might explain the fighting power of the Reds against an enemy with vastly superior resources. That was the Red officers' habit of saying, "Come on, boys," instead of "Go on, boys." During Nanjing's first and second final annihilation campaigns, casualties among Red officers were often as high as 50%. But the Red Army could not stand these sacrifices, and later adopted tactics tending somewhat to reduce the risk of life by experienced commanders. Nevertheless, in the 5th Jiangxi campaign, Red commanders' casualties averaged about 23% of the total officer personnel. One could see plenty of evidence of this in the Red districts. Common sights were youths still in their early 20s with an arm or a leg missing, or fingers shot away, or with ugly wounds on the head or anatomy, but still cheerful optimists about their revolution. Nearly every province in China was represented in the various armies. In this sense, the Red Army was probably the only national army in China. It was also the most widely travelled. Veteran cadres had crossed parts of 18 provinces. They probably knew more about Chinese geography than any other army. On their long march, they had found most of the old Chinese maps quite useless, and Red cartographers remapped many hundreds of miles of territory, especially in Aboriginal country and on the western frontiers. In the First Front Army, consisting of about 30,000 men, there was a high percentage of southerners, about 1/3 coming from Jiangxi, Fujian, Hunan or Guizhou. Nearly 40% were from the western provinces of Sichuan, Shanxi and Gansu. The First Front Army included some Aborigines, Miaos and Lolos, and attached to it was a newly organised Mohammedan Red Army. In the independent armies, the percentage of natives was much higher, averaging 3/4 of the total. From the highest commander down to the rank and file, these men ate and dressed alike. Battalion commanders and higher, however, were entitled to the use of a horse or a mule. I noticed there was even an equal sharing of the delicacies available, expressed while I was with the Red Army, chiefly in terms of watermelons and plums. There was very little difference in living quarters of commanders and men, and they passed freely back and forth without any formality. One thing had puzzled me. How did the Reds manage to feed, clothe, and equip their armies? Like many others, I had assumed they must live entirely on loot. This I discovered to be wrong, as I had already shown, for I saw they started to construct a self-supplying economy of their own as soon as they occupied a district, and this single fact made it possible for them to hold a base despite enemy blockade. I had also failed to realize on what almost unbelievably modest sums it was possible for a Chinese proletarian army to exist. The Reds had very limited output of armaments. Their enemy was really their main source of supply. For years the Reds had called the Kuomintang troops their ammunition carriers, and they claimed to capture more than 80% of their guns and more than 70% of their ammunition from enemy troops. The regular troops, as distinct from local partisans, I saw were equipped mainly with British, Czechoslovakian, German and American machine guns, rifles, automatic rifles, Mausers and mountain cannon, such as had been sold in large quantities to the Nanjing government. The only Russian-made rifles I saw with the Reds were the vintage of 1917. These had been captured from the troops of General Ma Honghui, as I heard directly from some of Ma's ex-soldiers themselves. General Ma, governor of what remained of Kuomintang Ningxia, had inherited those rifles from General Feng Yuxiang, who ruled this region in 1924 and got some arms from Outer Mongolia. Red regulars disdained to use these ancient weapons, which I saw only in the hands of the partisans. While I was in the Soviet districts, any contact with a Russian source of arms was physically impossible. The Reds were surrounded by various enemy troops, totaling nearly 400,000 men, and the enemy controlled every road to Outer Mongolia, Xinjiang, or the USSR. I gathered that they would be glad to get some of the manna that they were frequently accused of receiving by some miracle from Russia, but it was quite obvious from a glance at the map that until the Chinese Reds possessed much more territory to the north and to the west, Moscow would be unable to fill any orders, assuming Moscow would be so inclined, which was open to serious doubts. Second, it was a fact that the Reds had no highly paid and squeezing officials and generals, who in other Chinese armies absorbed most of the military funds. Great frugality was practiced in both the army and the Soviets. In effect, about the only burden of the army upon the people was the necessity of feeding and clothing it. Actually, as I have already said, the entire budget of the Northwest Soviets was then only $320,000 a month. Nearly 60% went to the maintenance of the armed forces. Old Lin Xuhan, the finance commissioner, was apologetic about that, but said that it was inevitable until the revolution has been consolidated. The armed forces then numbered, not including peasant auxiliaries, about 40,000 men. This was before the arrival in Gansu of the 2nd and 4th Front armies, after which Red territory greatly expanded, and the main Red forces in the northwest soon approached a total of 90,000 men. So much for statistics, but to understand why the Chinese Reds had survived all these years, it was necessary to get a glimpse of their inner spirit, their morale and fighting will, and their methods of training, and perhaps still more important, their political and military leadership. For example, what sort of man was Peng Dehuai, for whose head Nanjing once offered a reward sufficient to maintain his whole army, if Finance Commissioner Lin's figures were correct, for more than a month? 2. Impression of Peng Dehuai. The consolidation of command of the 1st, 2nd and 4th Front Red Armies had not yet occurred when I visited the front in August and September. 8 divisions of the 1st Front Red Army were then holding a line from the Great Wall in Ningxia down to Guyuan and Pingliang in Gansu. A vanguard of the 1st Army Corps was moving southward and westward to clear a road for Zhou De, who was leading the 2nd and 4th Front Armies up from Xinjiang and Sichuan, breaking through a deep cordon of Nanjing troops in southern Gansu. Yuangbao, an ancient Mohammedan walled city in southeast Ningxia, was headquarters for the 1st Front Army, and here I found its staff and commander, Peng Dehuai. Peng's commander as a Red Bandit had begun almost a decade before, when he led an uprising in the Kuomintang army of the polyamorous warlord governor General He Jian. Peng had risen from the ranks and won admission to a military school in Hunan, and later on to another school in Nanchang. After graduation he had quickly distinguished himself and secured rapid promotions. By 1927, when he was 28 years old, he was already a brigade commander and noted throughout the Hunanese army as the liberal officer who actually consulted his soldiers' committee. Peng's influence in the then left-wing Kuomintang in the army and in the Hunan military school was serious problems for He Jian. In the winter of 1927, General He began a drastic purgation of leftists in his troops and launched the notorious Hunan Peasants' Massacre, in which thousands of radical farmers and workers were killed as communists. He hesitated to act against Peng, however, because of his widespread popularity. It was a costly delay. In July 1928, with his own famous 1st Regiment as a nucleus, and joined by parts of the 2nd and 3rd Regiments and the cadets of the military school, Peng Dehuai directed the Pingjiang insurrection, which united with a peasant uprising and established the first Hunan Soviet government. 2 days later, Peng had accumulated an Iron Brotherhood of about 8,000 followers, and this was the 5th Red Army Corps. With this force, he attacked and captured the great walled city of Changsha, capital of Hunan, and put to rout He Jian's army of 60,000 men, then mostly opium smokers. The Red Army held this city for 10 days against counterattacks by combined Nanjing Hunan troops, but was finally forced to evacuate by greatly superior forces, including bombardment by foreign gunboats. It was shortly afterwards that Chiang Kai-shek began his first grand annihilation campaign against the Red Bandits. On the Long March of the Southern Reds, Peng Dehuai was commander of the vanguard 1st Army Corps. He broke through lines of tens of thousands of enemy troops, captured vital points on the route of advance, and secured communications for the main forces, at last winning his way to Shenxi and a refuge in the base of the Northwest Soviets. Men in his army told me that he walked most of the 6,000 miles of the Long March, frequently giving his horse to a tired or wounded comrade. I found Peng a gay, laughter-loving man, in excellent health except for a delicate stomach, the result of a week's forced diet of uncooked wheat grains and grass during the long march, and of semi-poisonous food, and a few days of no food at all. A veteran of scores of battles, he had been wounded but once, and then only superficially. I stayed in the compound where Peng had his headquarters in Yuangbao, and so I saw a great deal of him at the front. This headquarters, by the way, then in command of over 30,000 troops, was a simple room furnished with a table and wooden bench, 2 iron dispatch boxes, maps made by the Red Army, a field telephone, a towel and a wash basin, and the kang on which his blankets were spread. He had only a couple of uniforms, like the rest of his men, and they bore no insignia of rank. One personal article of attire, of which he was childishly proud, was a vest made from a parachute captured from an enemy aeroplane shot down during the long march. We shared many meals together. He ate sparingly and simply of the same food his men were given, consisting usually of cabbage, noodles, beans, mutton, and sometimes bread. Liu Xia grew beautiful melons of all kinds, and Peng was very fond of these. Your pampered investigator, however, found Peng poor competition in the business of melon eating, but had to bow before the greater talents of one of the doctors of Peng's staff, whose capacity had won him the nickname of Han Shi Guada, Han the Melon Eater. Open, forthright, and undeviating in his manner and speech, quick in his movements, full of laughter and wit, Peng was physically very active, an excellent rider, and a man of endurance. Perhaps this was partly because he was a non-smoker and a teetotaler. I was with him one day during his manoeuvres of the Red 2nd Division when we had to climb a very steep hill. "Run to the top!" Peng suddenly called out to his panting staff and me. He bounded off like a rabbit and beat us all to the summit. Another time when we were riding, he yelled out a similar challenge. In this way and others, he gave the impression of great unspent energy. Peng retired late and arose early, unlike Mao Zedong, who retired late and also got up late. As far as I could learn, Peng slept an average of only 4 or 5 hours a night. He never seemed rushed, but he was always busy. I remember the morning of the day the 1st Army Corps received orders to advance 200 li to Haiyuan, in enemy territory. Peng issued all the commands necessary before breakfast and came down to eat with me. Immediately afterwards he started off on the road, as if for an excursion to the countryside, walking along the main street of Yuangbao with his staff, stopping to speak to the Muslim priests who had assembled to bid him goodbye. The big army seemed to run itself. Government aeroplanes frequently dropped leaflets over red lines, offering from 50,000 to 100,000 for Peng, dead or alive, but he had only one sentry on duty before his headquarters, and he sauntered down the streets of the city without any bodyguard. While I was there, when thousands of handbills had been dropped offering rewards for himself, Xu Haidong, and Mao Zedong, Peng Dehuai ordered that they be preserved. They were printed on only one side, and there was a paper shortage in the Red Army. The blank side of these handbills was used later for printing Red Army propaganda. Peng was very fond of children, I noticed, and he was often followed by a group of them. Many youngsters who acted as mess boys, buglers, orderlies, and grooms were organized as regular units of the Red Army, in the groups called Shaonian Xianfanggui, or Young Vanguards. I often saw Peng seated with 2 or 3 little red devils, talking seriously to them about politics or their personal troubles. He treated them with great dignity. One day I went to Peng and part of his staff to visit a small arsenal near the front, and to inspect the workers' recreation room, their own Lenin Club or Lenin Club. There was a big cartoon drawn by the workers on one side of the room. It showed a kimonoed Japanese with his feet on Manchuria, Jiehou, and Hubei, and an upraised sword dripping with blood, poised over the rest of China. The caricatured Japanese had an enormous nose. "Who is that?" Peng asked a young vanguard whose duty it was to look after the Lenin Club. "That," replied the lad, "is a Japanese imperialist." "How do you know?" Peng demanded. "Just look at his big nose," was the response. Peng laughed and looked at me. "Well," he said, indicating at me, "here is a young guizi, foreign devil. Is he an imperialist?" "He is a foreign devil, all right," the young vanguard replied, "but not a Japanese imperialist. He has a big nose, but it isn't big enough for a Japanese imperialist." I pointed out to Peng that such cartoons might result in serious disillusionment when the Reds actually came into contact with the Japanese, and found Japanese noses quite as reasonable as their own. They might not recognize the enemy and might refuse to fight. "Don't worry," said the commander, "we will know a Japanese, whether he has a nose or not." Once I went to a performance of the 1st Army Corps' anti-Japanese theatre with Peng, and we sat down with the other soldiers on the turf below the improvised stage. He seemed to enjoy the plays immensely, and he led a demand for a favourite song. It grew quite chilly after dark, although it was still late August. I wrapped my padded coat closer to me. In the middle of the performance, I suddenly noticed with surprise that Peng had removed his own coat. Then I saw that he had put it around the little bugler sitting next to him. I understood Peng's affection for these little devils later on, when he yielded to persuasion one night and told me something of his childhood. The trials of his own youth might amaze an Occidental ear, but they were typical enough of background events which explained many of the young Chinese who, like him, saw red. 3. Why is a red? Peng Dehuai was born in a village of Xiangdan-xian, near the native place of Mao Zedong. It was a wealthy farming community besides the blue-flowing Xiang River, about 90 li from Changsha. Xiangdan was one of the prettiest parts of Hunan, a green countryside quilted with deep rice lands and thickets of tall bamboo. More than 1 million people lived in this one county. Though the soil of Xiangdan was rich, the majority of the peasants were miserably poor, illiterate, and little better than serfs, according to Peng. Landlords were all powerful there, owned the finest lands, and charged exorbitant rents and taxes, for they were, in many cases, also the officials, the gentry. Several great landlords in Xiangtan had incomes from 40 to 50,000 tan of rice annually, and some of the wealthiest grain merchants in the province lived there. Peng's own family were rich peasants. His mother died when he was 6, his father remarried, and this second wife hated Peng because he was a constant reminder of her predecessor. She sent him to an old-style Chinese school where the teacher frequently beat him. Peng was apparently quite capable of looking after his own interests. In the midst of one of these beatings, he picked up a stool, scored a hit, and fled. The teacher brought a lawsuit against him in the local courts, and his stepmother denounced him. His father was rather indifferent in this quarrel, but to keep peace with his wife, he sent the young stool-tosser off to live with an aunt whom he liked. She put the boy into a so-called modern school. There he met a radical teacher who did not believe in filial worship. One day, when Dehuai was playing in the park, this teacher came along and sat down to talk with him. Peng asked whether he worshipped his parents, and whether he thought Peng should worship his. As for himself, said the teacher, he did not believe in such nonsense. Children are brought into the world while their parents were playing, just as Dehuai had been playing in this park. I like this notion, said Peng, and I mentioned it to my aunt when I went home. She was horrified, and the very next day had me withdrawn from the evil foreign influence. Hearing something of the young man's objection to filial worship, his grandmother began to pray regularly on the 1st and 15th of each month and at festivals or when it stormed, for heaven to strike this unfilial child and destroy him. In Peng's own words, my grandmother regarded us all as her slaves. She was a heavy smoker of opium. I hated the smell of it, and one night when I could stand it no longer, I got up and kicked a pan of her opium from the stove. She was furious. She called a meeting of the whole clan and formally demanded my death by drowning, because I was an unfilial child. She made a long list of charges against me. The clan was about ready to carry out her demand. My stepmother agreed that I should die, and my father said that since it was the family will, he would not object. Then an uncle, my own mother's brother, stepped forward and bitterly attacked my parents for their failure to educate me properly. He said that it was their fault, and that in this case no child could be held responsible. My life was spared, but I had to leave home. I was 9 years old. It was cold October, and I owned nothing but my coat and trousers. My stepmother tried to take those from me, but I proved that they did not belong to her, but had been given to me by my own mother. Such was the beginning of Peng Dehuai's life in the great world. He got a job first as a cowherd and next as a coal miner, where he pulled a bellows for 14 hours a day. Weary of these long hours, he fled from the mine to become a shoemaker's apprentice, working only 12 hours a day. He received no salary, and after 8 months he ran away again, this time to work in a sodium mine. The mine closed. He was forced to seek work once more. Still owning nothing but the rags on his back, he became a dike builder. Here he had a quote-unquote good job, actually received wages, and in 2 years had saved 1,500 cash, about $12. But he lost everything when a change of warlords rendered the currency worthless. Very depressed, he decided to return to his native district. Now 16, Peng went to call on a rich uncle, the uncle who had saved his life. This man's own son had just died, and he had always liked Dehuai, and he welcomed him and offered him a home. Here Peng fell in love with his own cousin, and the uncle was favourably disposed to a betrothal. They studied under a Chinese tutor, played together, and planned their future. These plans were interrupted by Peng's irrepressible impetuosity. Next year there was a big rice famine in Hunan, and thousands of peasants were destitute. Peng's uncle helped many, but the biggest stores of rice were held by a great landlord merchant who profiteered fabulously. One day a crowd of over 200 peasants gathered at his house, demanding that the merchant sell them rice without profit, traditionally expected of a virtuous man in time of famine. The rich man refused to discuss it, had the people driven away, and barred his gates. Peng went on. I was passing his place, and paused to watch the demonstration. I saw that many of the men were half-starved, and I knew this man had over 10,000 tan of rice in his bins, and that he had refused to help the starving at all. I became infuriated, and led the peasants to attack and invade his house. They carted off most of his stores. Thinking of it afterwards, I did not know exactly why I had done that. I only knew that he should have sold rice to the poor, and that it was right for them to take it from him if he did not. Peng had to flee once more for his life, and this time he was old enough to join the army. His career as a soldier began. Not long afterwards he was to become a revolutionary. At 18 he was made a platoon commander and was involved in a plot to overthrow the ruling government, Du Zhenhu. Peng had been deeply influenced by a student leader in his army, whom the Du Zhen had killed. Entrusted with the task of assassinating Hu, he entered Changsha, waited for him to pass down the street one day, and threw a bomb at him. The bomb failed to explode. Peng escaped. Not long afterwards, Dr. Sun Yat-sen became generalissimo of the Allied armies of the southwest, and succeeded in defeating Du Zhenhu, but was subsequently driven out of Hunan again by the northern militarists. Peng fled with Sun's army. Sent upon a mission of espionage by Cheng Jian, one of Sun's commanders, Peng returned to Changsha, was betrayed and arrested. Zhang Qingyao was then in power in Hunan. Peng described his experiences. I was tortured every day for about an hour in many different ways. One night my feet were bound and my hands were tied behind my back. I was hung from a roof with a rope around my wrists. Then big stones were piled on my back while the jailers stood around kicking me and demanding that I confess, for they still had no evidence against me. Many times I fainted. This torture went on for about a month. I used to think after every torture that next time I would confess, as I could not stand it. But each time I decided I would not give up till the next day. In the end, they got nothing from me, and to my surprise I was finally released. One of the deep satisfactions of my life came some years later when we, the Red Army, captured Changsha and destroyed that old torture chamber. We released several hundred political prisoners there, many of them half dead from beatings, fiendish treatment, and starvation. When Peng had regained his freedom, he went back to his uncle's home to visit his cousin. He intended to marry her, as he still considered himself betrothed. He found out that she had died. Re-enlisting in the army, he soon afterwards received his first commission and was sent to the Hunan military school. Following his graduation, he became a battalion commander in the 2nd Division, under Lu Diping, and was assigned to duty in his native district. My uncle died, and, hearing of it, I arranged to return to attend the funeral. On the way there, I had to pass my childhood home. My old grandmother was alive, now past 80, and still very active. Learning that I was returning, she walked down the road 10 li to meet me and begged my forgiveness for the past. She was very humble and very respectful. I was quite surprised by this change. What could be the cause of it? Then I reflected that it was not due to any change in her personal feeling, but to my rise in the world from a social outcast to an army officer with a salary of $200 a month. I gave the old lady a little money, and she sang my praises in the family as a model filial son. I asked Peng what reading had influenced him. He said that when, as a youth, he read Sima Guang's Zizhijian, History of Governing, he began for the first time to have some serious thoughts concerning the responsibility of a soldier to society. The battles described by Sima Guang were completely pointless and only caused suffering to the people, very much like those that were being fought between the militarists in China in my own time. What could we do to give purpose to our struggles and bring about a permanent change? Peng read Liang Qichao and Kang Yuwei and many of the other writers who had influenced Mao Zedong. For a time he had some interest in anarchism. In Chen Duxiu's New Youth he learned of socialism, and from that point he began to study Marxism. The nationalist revolution was forming. He was a regimental commander, and he felt the necessity of a political doctrine to give morale to his troops. Sun Yat-sen's Sanminzhuyi, the 3 principles of the people, was an improvement over Liang Qichao, but Peng felt that it was too vague and confused. Although he was by then a member of the Kuomintang, Bukharin's ABC of Communism seemed to him, for the first time, a book that presented a practicable and reasonable form of society and government. By 1926, Peng had read the Communist Manifesto, an outline of capital, a new conception of society by a leading Chinese communist, Kautsky's class struggle, and many articles and pamphlets giving a materialist interpretation of the Chinese Revolution. Formerly, said Peng, I had been merely dissatisfied with society, but saw little chance of making any fundamental improvement. After reading the Communist Manifesto, I dropped my pessimism and began working with a new conviction that society could be changed. Although Peng did not join the Communist Party until 1927, he enlisted communist youths in his troops and began Marxist courses of political training and organized soldiers' committees. In 1926, he married a middle school girl who was a member of the Socialist Youth, but during the revolution they became separated. Peng had not seen her since 1928. It was the end of July of that year that Peng revolted, seized Pingjiang, and began his long career as a rebel, or bandit, as you prefer. He had been pacing back and forth, grinning and joking as he told me these incidents of his youth and struggle, carrying in his hand a Mongolian horsehair fly-swatter, which he brandished absent-mindedly for emphasis. A messenger now brought in a sheaf of radiograms, and he suddenly looked the serious commander again as he turned to read them. Well, that's about all, anyway, he concluded. That explains something about how a man becomes a red bandit. 4. Tactics of partisan warfare. We sat in the house of a former magistrate in Yuangbao, in a 2-story edifice with a balustraded porch, a porch from which you could look out towards Mongolia, across the plains of Ningxia. On the high, stout walls of Wangyu Bao, a squad of red buglers was practicing, and from the corner of the fort-like city flew a big scarlet flag, its yellow hammer and sickle cracking out in the breeze now and then as though a fist were behind it. We could look down on one side to a clean courtyard where Mohammedan women were hulling rice and baking. Washing hung from a line on another side. In a distant square, some red soldiers were practicing wall scaling, broad jumping, and grenade throwing. Although Peng Dehuai and Zedong were Tongxiande, or natives of the same county, they had not met until the Red Army was formed. Peng spoke with a pronounced southern accent and machine-gun rapidity. I could understand him clearly only when he spoke slowly and simply, which he was generally too impatient to do. For this interview, Huang Hua, whose English was excellent, acted as my interpreter. The main reason for partisan warfare in China, Peng began, is economic bankruptcy, and especially rural bankruptcy. Imperialism, landlordism, and militaristic wars have combined to destroy the basis of the rural economy, and it cannot be restored without eliminating its chief enemies. Enormous taxes, together with Japanese invasion, both military and economic, have accelerated the rate of this peasant bankruptcy, aided by the landlords. The gentry's exploitation of power in the villages makes life difficult for the majority of the peasants. There is widespread unemployment in the villages. There is a readiness among the poor classes to fight for a change. Second, partisan warfare has developed because of the backwardness of the hinterland. Lack of communications, roads, railways, and bridges makes it possible for the people to arm and organize. Third, although the strategic centers of China are all more or less dominated by the imperialists, this control is uneven and not unified. Between the imperialist spheres of influence there are wide gaps, and in these partisan warfare can quickly develop. Fourth, the Great Revolution of 1925 to 1927 fixed the revolutionary idea in the minds of many, and even after the counter-revolution in 1927 and the killings in the cities, many revolutionaries refused to submit and sought a method of opposition. Owing to the special system of joint imperialist comprador control in the big cities, the lack of an armed force in the beginning, it was impossible to find a base in urban areas, so many revolutionary workers, intellectuals, and peasants returned to the rural districts to lead the peasant insurrections. Intolerable social and economic conditions had created the demand for revolution. It was only necessary to give leadership, form, and objectives to this rural mass movement. All these factors contributed to the growth and success of revolutionary partisan warfare. They are, of course, quite simply stated, and do not go into the deeper problems behind them. Besides these reasons, partisan warfare has succeeded, and partisan detachments have developed their invincibility because of the identity of the masses with the fighting forces. Red partisans are not only warriors, they are at the same time political propagandists and organizers. Wherever they go, they carry the message of the revolution, patiently explain to the mass of the peasantry the real missions of the Red Army, and make them understand that only through revolution can their needs be realized, and why the Communist Party is the only party which can lead them. But as regards the specific tasks of partisan warfare, you have asked why in some places it developed very rapidly and became a strong political power, while in others it was easily and quickly suppressed. This is an interesting question. First of all, partisan warfare in China can only succeed under the revolutionary leadership of the Communist Party, because only the Communist Party wants to and can satisfy the demands of the peasantry, understands the necessity for deep, broad, constant political and organizational work among the peasantry, and can fulfill its promises. Second, the active field leadership of partisan units must be determined, fearless, and courageous. Without these qualities in the leadership, partisan warfare not only cannot grow, but it must wither and die under the reactionary offensive. Because the masses are only interested in the practical solution of their problems of livelihood, it is possible to develop partisan warfare only by the immediate satisfaction of their most urgent demands. This means that the exploiting class must be promptly disarmed. Partisans can never remain stationary. To do so is to invite destruction. They must constantly expand, building around themselves ever new peripheral and protective groups. Political training must accompany every phase of the struggle, and local leaders must be developed from every new group added to the revolution. Leaders from the outside can be introduced to a limited extent, but no lasting success can be achieved if the movement fails to inspire, awaken, and constantly create new leaders from the local mass. One of the chief reasons why Marshal Zhang Xieliang began to respect the Reds, the enemy he had been sent to destroy, was that he had been impressed with their skill at this type of combat, and had come to believe that they could be utilized in fighting Japan. After he had reached a kind of truce with them, he invited Red instructors to teach in the new officers' training school opened for his Manchurian army in Xianxi, and there the communist influence rapidly developed. Marshal Zhang and most of his officers, bitterly anti-Japanese, had become convinced that it was superior mobility and maneuvering ability on which China would ultimately have to depend in a war with Japan. They were anxious to know all that the Reds had learned about the tactics and strategy of maneuvering warfare during 10 years of fighting experience. Was it possible, I asked Peng Dehuai, to summarize the principles of Red partisan warfare? He had promised to do so, and had written down a few notes from which he now read. For a fuller discussion of the subject, he referred me to a small book written by Mao Zedong and published in the Soviet districts, but this I was unable to get. There are certain rules of tactics which must be followed, Peng explained, if the newly developing partisan army is to be successful. These we have learned from our long experience, and though they are variable according to conditions, I believe that departures from them generally lead to extinction. The main principles can be summarized under 10 points, like this. First, partisans must not fight any losing battles. Unless there are strong indications of success, they should refuse any engagement. Second, surprise is the main offensive tactic of the well-led partisan group. Static warfare must be avoided. The partisan brigade has no auxiliary force, no rear, no line of supplies and communications, except that of the enemy. In a lengthy positional war, the enemy has every advantage, and in general the chances of partisan success diminish in proportion to the duration of the battle. Third, a careful and detailed plan of attack, and especially of retreat, must be worked out before any engagement is offered or accepted. Any attack undertaken without full knowledge of the particular situation opens the partisans to outmaneuver by the enemy. Superior maneuvering ability is a great advantage of the partisans, and errors in its manipulation mean extinction. Fourth, in the development of partisan warfare, the greatest attention must be paid to the Mintuan, the first, last, and most determined line of resistance of the landlords and gentry. The Mintuan must be destroyed militarily, but must, if at all possible, be won over politically on the side of the masses. Unless the Mintuan in a district is disarmed, it is impossible to mobilize the masses. Fifth, in a regular engagement with enemy troops, the partisans must exceed the enemy in numbers. But if the enemy's regular troops are moving, resting, or poorly guarded, a swift, determined surprise flank attack on an organically vital spot of the enemy's line can be made by a much smaller group. Many a Red short attack has been carried out with only a few hundred men against an enemy of thousands. Surprise, speed, courage, unwavering decision, flawlessly planned maneuver, and the selection of the most vulnerable and vital spot in the enemy's anatomy are absolutely essential to the complete victory of this kind of attack. Only a highly experienced partisan army can succeed at it. Sixth, in actual combat, the partisan line must have the greatest elasticity. Once it becomes obvious that their calculation of enemy strength or preparedness or fighting power is in error, the partisans should be able to disengage and withdraw with the same speed as they began the attack. Reliable cadres must be developed in every unit, fully capable of replacing any commander eliminated in battle. Resourcefulness of subalterns must be greatly relied upon in partisan warfare. Seventh, the tactics of distraction, decoy, diversion, ambush, feint, and irritation must be mastered. In Chinese, these tactics are called the principle of pretending to attack the east while attacking the west. 8th, partisans must avoid engagements with the main force of the enemy, concentrating on the weakest link or the most vital. 9th, every precaution must be taken to prevent the enemy from locating the partisans' main forces. For this reason, partisans should avoid concentrating in one place when the enemy is advancing, and should change their position frequently, 2 or 3 times in one day or night, just before an attack. Secrecy in the movements of the partisans is absolutely essential to success. Well-worked-out plans for dispersal after an attack are as important as plans for the actual concentration to meet an enemy advance. 10th, besides superior mobility, the partisans, being inseparable from the local masses, have the advantage of superior intelligence, and the greatest use must be made of this. Ideally, every peasant should be on the partisans' intelligence staff, so that it is impossible for the enemy to take a step without the partisans knowing of it. Great care should be taken to protect the channels of information about the enemy, and several auxiliary lines of intelligence should always be established. These were the main principles, according to Commander Peng, on which the Red Army had built up its strength, and it was necessary to employ them in every enlargement of Red territory. He finished up. So you see that successful partisan warfare demands these fundamentals: fearlessness, swiftness, intelligent planning, mobility, secrecy, and suddenness and determination in action. Lacking any of these, it is difficult for partisans to win victories. If in the beginning of a battle they lack quick decision, the battle will lengthen. They must be swift, otherwise the enemy will be reinforced. They must be mobile and elastic, otherwise they will lose their advantages of maneuver. Finally, it is absolutely necessary for the partisans to win the support and participation of the peasant masses. If there is no movement of the armed peasantry, there is in fact no partisan base, and the army cannot exist. Only by implanting itself deeply in the hearts of the people, only by fulfilling the demands of the masses, only by consolidating a base in the peasant soviets, and only by sheltering in the shadow of the masses, can partisan warfare bring revolutionary victory. Peng had been pacing up and down the balcony, delivering one of his points each time he returned to the table where I sat writing. Now he suddenly stopped and stood thoughtfully reflecting. But nothing, absolutely nothing, he said, is more important than this, that the Red Army is a people's army, and has grown because the people helped us. I remember in the winter of 1928 when my forces in Hunan had dwindled to a little over 2,000 men, and we were encircled. The Kuomintang troops burned down all the houses in a surrounding area of about 300 li, seized all the food there, and then blockaded us. We had no cloth, we used bark to make short tunics, and we cut up the legs of our trousers to make shoes. Our hair grew long, we had no quarters, no lights, no salt. We were sick and half-starved. The peasants were no better off, and we would not touch what little they had. But the peasants encouraged us. They dug from the ground the grain which they had hidden from the white troops and gave it to us, and they ate potatoes and wild roots. They hated the whites for burning their homes and stealing their food. Even before we arrived, they had fought the landlords and tax collectors, so they welcomed us. Many joined us, and nearly all helped us in some way. They wanted us to win. And because of that, we fought on and broke through the blockade. He turned to me and ended simply. Tactics are important, but we could not exist if the majority of the people did not support us. We are nothing but the fist of the people beating their oppressors. 5. Life of the Red Warrior. The Chinese soldier had a poor reputation abroad. Many people thought his gun was chiefly ornamental, that he did his only fighting with an opium pipe, that any rifle shots exchanged were by mutual agreement, and in the air. The battles were fought with silver, and the soldier was paid in opium. Some of that has been true enough of most armies in the past, but the well-equipped first-class Chinese soldier, white as well as red, was no longer a vaudeville joke. There was still plenty of comic opera armies in China, but in recent years there had arisen a new type of Chinese warrior, who would soon supplant the old. Civil war, especially the class war between reds and whites, had been very costly, and often heavily and brutally fought, with no quarter or umbrella truces given by either side. Those 10 years of strife in China had, if nothing else, created the nucleus of a fighting force and military brains experienced in the use of modern technique and tactics, which would before long build a powerful army that could no longer be dismissed as a tin soldier affair. The trouble had never been with the human material itself. The Chinese could fight as well as any people, as I had learned during the Shanghai War in 1932. Technical limitations disregarded, the trouble had been the inability of the command to train that human material at its disposal and give to it military discipline, political morale, and the will to victory. Therein lay the superiority of the Red Army. It was so often the only side in a battle that believed it was fighting for something. It was the Reds' greater success at the educative tasks in the building of an army that enabled them to withstand the tremendous technical and numerical superiority of their enemy. For sheer dogged endurance and ability to stand hardship without complaint, the Chinese peasants, who composed the greater part of the Red Army, were unbeatable. This was shown by the Long March, in which the Reds took a terrific pummeling from all sides, slept in the open air, and lived on unhulled wheat for many days, but still held together and emerged as a potent military force. It was also demonstrated by the rigours and impositions of daily life in the Red Army. The Red troops I saw in Ningxia and Gansu were quartered in caves, former stables of wealthy landlords, hastily erected barracks of clay and wood, and in compounds and houses abandoned by former officials or garrison troops. They slept on hard kang, without mattresses and with only a cotton blanket each, yet these rooms were fairly neat, clean, and orderly. Although their floors, walls, and ceilings were of whitewashed clay, they seldom had tables or desks, and piles of bricks or rocks served as chairs, most of the furniture having been destroyed or carted off by the enemy before his retreat. Every company had its own cook and commissariat. The Red diet was extremely simple. Millet and cabbage, with a little mutton and sometimes pork, were an average meal, but they seemed to thrive on it. Coffee, tea, cakes, sweets of any kind, or fresh vegetables were almost unknown, but also unmissed. Coffee tins were more valued than their contents. Nobody liked coffee. It tasted like medicine, but a good tin could be made into a serviceable canteen. Hot water was almost the only beverage consumed, and the drinking of cold water, very often contaminated, was specifically forbidden. The Red soldier, when not fighting, had a full and busy day. In the northwest, as in the south, he had long periods of military inactivity, for when a new district was occupied, the Red Army settled down for a month or two to establish Soviets and otherwise consolidate, and only put a small force on outpost duty. The enemy was nearly always on the defensive, except when one of their periodic big annihilation drives was launched. When not in the trenches or on outpost duty, the Red soldier observed a 6-day week. He arose at 5 and retired to a taps sounded at 9. The schedule of the day included an hour's exercise immediately after rising, breakfast, 2 hours of military drill, 2 hours of political lectures and discussion, lunch, an hour of rest, 2 hours of character study, 2 hours of games and sports, dinner, songs and group meetings, and then taps. Keen competition was encouraged in broad jumping, high jumping, running, wall scaling, rope climbing, rope skipping, grenade throwing, and marksmanship. Watching the leaps of the Reds over the walls, bars, and ropes, you could easily understand why the Chinese press had nicknamed them human monkeys for their swift movement and agile feats of mountain climbing. Pennants were given in group competitions, from the squad up to the regiment, in sports, military drill, political knowledge, literacy, and public health. I saw these banners displayed in the Lenin Clubs of units that had won such distinctions. There was a Lenin Club for every company and for every regiment, and here all social and cultural life had its centre. The regimental Lenin rooms were the best in the unit's quarters, but that said little. Such as I saw were always crude makeshift affairs, and what interest they aroused derived from the human activity in them rather than from their furnishings. They all had pictures of Marx and Lenin drawn by company or regimental talent. Like some of the Chinese pictures of Christ, they generally bore a distinctly oriental appearance, with eyes like stitches, and either a bulbous forehead like an image of Confucius, or no forehead at all. Marx, whose Chinese moniker is Ma Ke Si, was nicknamed by the Red soldiers Ma Da Huzi, or Ma the Big Beard. They seemed to have an affectionate awe for him. That was especially true of the Mohammedans, who appeared to be the only people in China capable of growing luxuriant beards as well as appreciating them. Another feature of the Lenin Club was a corner devoted to the study of military tactics in models of clay. Miniature towns, mountains, forts, rivers, lakes, and bridges were constructed in these corners, and toy armies battled back and forth while the class studied some tactical problem. Thus, in some places you saw the Sino-Japanese battles in Shanghai refought, in another the battles on the Great Wall, but most of the models were devoted to past battles between the Reds and the Kuomintang. They were also used to explain the geographical features of the district in which the army was stationed, to dramatize the tactics of a hypothetical campaign, or merely to animate the geography and political lessons which Red soldiers got as part of their military training. In a hospital company's Lenin room I saw displays of clay models of various parts of the anatomy, showing the effects of certain diseases, illustrating body hygiene, and so on. Another corner of the club was devoted to character study, and here one saw the notebook of each warrior hanging on its appointed peg on the wall. There were 3 character study groups: those who knew fewer than 100 characters, those who knew from 100 to 300, and those who could read and write more than 300 characters. The Reds had printed their own textbooks, using political propaganda as materials of study. For each of these groups, the political department of each company, battalion, regiment, and army was responsible for mass education as well as political training. Only about 20% of the 1st Army Corps, I was told, was still xiazi, or blind men, as the Chinese call total illiterates. The principle of the Lenin Club, it was explained to me by Xiao Hua, the 22-year-old political director of the 2nd Division, are quite simple. All the life and activity of them must be connected with the daily work and development of the men. It must be done by the men themselves. It must be simple and easy to understand. It must combine recreational value with practical education about the immediate tasks of the army. The library of the average Lenin Club consisted chiefly of standard Chinese Red Army textbooks and lectures, a history of the Russian Revolution, miscellaneous magazines which might have been smuggled in or captured from the white areas, and files of Chinese Soviet publications like the Red China Daily News, Party Work, Struggle, and others. There was also a wall newspaper in every club, and a committee of soldiers was responsible for keeping it up to date. The wall newspaper gave considerable insight into the soldier's problems and a measure of his development. I took down full notes, in translation, of many of these papers. A typical one was in the Lenin Club of 2nd Company, 3rd Regiment, 2nd Division, in Yuangbao, for September the 1st. Its contents included daily and weekly notices of the Communist Party and the Communist Youth League, a couple of columns of crude contributions from the newly literate, mostly revolutionary exhortations and slogans, radio bulletins of Red Army victories in South Gansu, new songs to be learned, political news from the white areas, and, perhaps most interesting of all, 2 sections called the Red and Black columns, devoted respectively to praise and criticism. Praise consisted of tributes to the courage, bravery, unselfishness, diligence, or other virtues of individuals or groups. In the Black column, comrades lashed into each other and their officers, by name, for things such as failure to keep a rifle clean, slackness in study, losing a hand grenade or bayonet, smoking on duty, political backwardness, individualism, reactionary habits, etc. On one Black column I saw a cook criticised for his half-done millet. In another, a cook denounced a man for always complaining about his productions. Many people had been amused to hear about the Reds' passion for the English game of table tennis. It was bizarre, somehow, but every Lenin Club in its centre had a big ping-pong table, usually serving double duty as a dining table. The Lenin Clubs were turned into mess halls at chow time, but there were always 4 or 5 bandits armed with bats, balls, and the net, urging the comrades to hurry it up. They wanted to get on with their game. Each company boasted a ping-pong champion, and I was no match for them. Some of the Lenin Clubs had record players confiscated from the homes of former officials or white officers. One night I was entertained with a concert on a captured American Victrola, described as a gift from General Gao Guizi, who was then in command of a Kuomintang army fighting the Reds on the Shanxi-Shuiyuan border. General Gao's records were all Chinese, with 2 exceptions, both French. One had on it the Marseillaise and Tipperary. The other was a French comic song. Both brought on storms of laughter from the astonished listeners, who understood not a word. The Reds had many games of their own, and were constantly inventing new ones. One, called Shizi Pai, or No Character Cards, was a contest that helped illiterates learn their basic hieroglyphics. Another game was somewhat like poker, but the high cards were marked Down with Japanese Imperialism, Down with the Landlords, Long Live the Revolution, and Long Live the Soviets. Minor cards carried slogans that changed according to the political and military objectives. There were many group games. The Communist Youth League members were responsible for the programs of the Lenin Clubs, and likewise led mass singing every day. Many of the songs were sung to Christian hymn tunes. All these activities kept the mass of the soldiers fairly busy and fairly healthy. There were no camp followers or prostitutes with the Red troops I saw. Opium smoking was prohibited. I saw no opium or opium pipes with the Reds on the road, nor in any barracks I visited. Cigarette smoking was not forbidden except while on duty, but there was propaganda against it, and few Red soldiers seemed to smoke. Such was the organised life of the regular Red soldiers behind the front. Not so very exciting, perhaps, but rather different from the propagandist's tales, from which one might have gathered that the Reds' life consisted of wild orgies, entertainment by naked dancers, and rapine before and after meals. The truth seemed to be that a revolutionary army anywhere was always in danger of becoming too puritanical, rather than the contrary. Some of the Reds' ideas had now been copied, with much better facilities for realizing them, by Chiang Kai-shek's crack New Army and his New Life movement. But one thing the White Armies could not copy, the Reds claimed, was their revolutionary consciousness. What this was like could best be seen at a political session of Red troops, where one could hear the firmly implanted credos that these youths fought and died for. 6. Session in politics. Finding myself with an idle afternoon, I went around to call on Liu Xia, a member of the Red Army political department, with offices in a guardhouse on the city wall of Yuangbao. By now it was obvious that the Red commanders were loyal Marxists and were effectively under the guidance of the Communist Party, through its representatives in the political department of every unit of the army. Of course, Mr. Trotsky might have disputed whether they were good Marxists or bad Marxists, but the point was that they were conscious fighters for socialism in their fashion. They knew what they wanted, and believed themselves to be part of a world movement. Liu Xia was one of the most serious-minded young men I had met among the Reds, and one of the hardest working. An intensely earnest youth of 25, with an aesthetic, intellectual face. He was extremely courteous, gentle, and inoffensive. I sensed an immense inner spiritual pride in him about his connection with the Red Army. He had a pure feeling of religious absolutism about communism, and I believed he would not have hesitated, on command, to shoot any number of counter-revolutionaries or traitors. I had no right to break in on his day, but I knew he had orders to assist me in any way possible. He had several times acted as my interpreter, so I made the most of it. I think also that he disliked foreigners, and when later on he gave me a brief biography of himself, I could not blame him. He had been twice arrested and imprisoned by foreign police in his own country. Liu was an ex-student of Eastview Academy, an American missionary school in Shengzhoufu, Hunan. He had been a devout Christian, a fundamentalist, and a good YMCA man until 1926 and the Great Revolution. One day he led a student strike, was expelled, and was disowned by his family. Awakened to the imperialistic basis of missionary institutions in China, he went to Shanghai, became active in the student movement there, joined the Communist Party, and was imprisoned by police in the French concession. Released in 1929, he rejoined his comrades, worked under the provincial committee of the Communist Party, was arrested by British police, put in the notorious Ward Road jail, tortured by electricity to extort a confession, handed over to the Chinese authorities, jailed again, and did not get his freedom until 1931. He was then just 20 years old. Shortly afterwards he was sent by the Reds' underground railway to the Fujian Soviet district, and had ever since been with the Red Army. Liu agreed to accompany me, and together we found our way to a Lenin Club where there was a political class in session. It was a meeting of a company in the 2nd Regiment of the 2nd Division, 1st Army Corps, and 62 were present. This was the advanced section of the company. There was also a second section. Political education in the Red Army is conducted through 3 main groups, each of which is divided into the 2 sections mentioned. Each elects its soldiers' committee to consult with its superior officers and send delegates to the Soviets. The 3 groups are for company officers and higher, squad commanders and the rank and file, and the service corps, cooks, grooms, muleteers, carriers, sweepers, and young vanguards. Green boughs decorated the room, and a big red paper star was fixed over the doorway. Inside were the usual pictures of Marx and Lenin, and on another wall were photographs of Generals Cai Dinggai and Jiang Guangnai, heroes of the Shanghai War. There was a big picture of the Russian Red Army massed in Red Square in an October anniversary demonstration, a photograph torn from a Shanghai magazine. Finally, there was a large lithograph of General Feng Yuxiang, with a slogan under it, 还我山河, Give back our mountains and rivers, an old classical phrase, now revived by the anti-Japanese movement. The men sat on brick seats, which they had brought with them. One often saw soldier students going to school with notebooks in one hand and a brick in the other, and the class was led by the company commander and the political commissar, both members of the Communist Party. The subject, I gathered, was progress in the anti-Japanese movement. A lanky, gaunt-faced youth was speaking. He seemed to be summarizing 5 years of Sino-Japanese undeclared war, and he was shouting at the top of his lungs. He told of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and his own experiences there, as a former soldier in the army of Marshal Jiang Shiliang. He condemned Nanjing for ordering non-resistance. Then he described the Japanese invasion of Shanghai, Jiehou, Hubei, Chaha, and Suiyuan. In each case he maintained the Kuomintang Dog Party had retreated without fighting. They had given the Japanese bandits a fourth of our country. Why, he demanded, intensely excited, his voice breaking a little. Why don't our Chinese armies fight to save China? Because they don't want to? No, we Dongbei men asked our officers nearly every day to lead us to the front, to fight back to our homeland. Every Chinese hates to become a Japanese slave, but China's armies cannot fight because of our 卖国政府, literally, sell country government. But the people will fight if our Red Army leads. He ended up with a summary of the growth of the anti-Japanese movement in the northwest under the communists. Another arose, stood at rigid attention, his hands pressed closely to his sides. Liu Xia whispered to me that he was a squad leader, a corporal who'd made the long march. It is only the traitors who do not want to fight Japan. It is only the rich men, the militarists, the tax collectors, the landlords and the bankers who start the cooperate with Japan movement and the joint war against communism slogan. They are only a handful. They are not Chinese. Our peasants and workers, every one, want to fight to save the country. They only need to be shown a road. Why do I know this? In our Jiangxi Soviets, we had a population of only 3 million, yet we recruited volunteer partisan armies of 500,000 men. Our loyal Soviets enthusiastically supported us in the war against the traitorous white troops. When the Red Army is victorious over the whole country, our partisans will number over 10 million. Let Japan dare to try to rob us then. And much more of it. One after another they stood up to utter their hatred against Japan, sometimes emphasizing, sometimes disagreeing with the previous speaker's remark, sometimes giving their answers to questions from the discussion leaders, making suggestions for broadening the anti-Japanese movement, and so on. One youth told of the response of the people to the Red Army's anti-Japanese Shanxi expedition last year. The Laobaixing, the people, welcomed us, he shouted. They came by the hundreds to join us. They bought us tea and cakes on the road as we marched. Many left their fields to come to join us, or cheer us. They understood quite clearly who were the traitors and who were the patriots, who want to fight Japan and who want to sell China to Japan. Our problem is to awaken the whole country as we awakened the people of Shanxi. One talked about the anti-Japanese student movement in the white districts, another about the anti-Japanese movement in the southwest, and a Dongbei man told of the reasons why Marshal Jiang Xiliang's Manchurian soldiers refused to fight the Reds anymore. Chinese must not fight Chinese. We must all unite to oppose Japanese imperialism. We must win back our lost homeland, he concluded with terse eloquence. A fourth spoke of the Manchurian anti-Japanese volunteers, and another of the strikes of Chinese workers in the Japanese mills of China. The discussions continued for more than an hour. Occasionally the commander or political commissar interrupted to sum up what had been said, to elaborate a point, or to add new information, occasionally to correct something that had been said. The men took brief, laborious notes in their little notebooks, and the serious task of thought furrowed their honest peasant faces. The whole session was crudely propagandist, and exaggeration of fact did not bother them in the least. It was self-proselytizing in a way, with materials selected to prove a single thesis, but that it was potent in its effects was manifest. Simple but powerful convictions, logical in shape, were forming in these young, little tutored minds, credos such as every great crusading army has found necessary in order to stiffen itself with that spiritual unity, that courage, and that readiness to die in a cause, which we call morale. I interrupted to ask some questions. They were answered by a show of hands. I discovered that of the 62 present, 9 were from urban working-class families, while the rest were straight from the land. 21 were former white soldiers, and 6 from the old Manchurian army. Only 8 of this group were married, and 21 were from red families, that is, from families of poor peasants who had shared in the land redistribution under some Soviet. 34 of the group were under 20 years of age, 24 were between 20 and 25, 4 were over 30. In what way, I asked, is the Red Army better than the other armies of China? This brought half a dozen men to their feet at once. The Red Army is a revolutionary army. The Red Army is anti-Japanese. The Red Army helps the peasants. Living conditions in the Red Army are entirely different from the White Army life. Here we are many equals. In the White Army the soldier masses are oppressed. Here we fight for ourselves and the masses. The White Army fights for the gentry and the landlords. Officers and men live the same in the Red Army. In the White Army the soldiers are treated like slaves. Officers of the Red Army come from our own ranks and win their appointments by merit alone. White officers buy their jobs or use political influence. Red soldiers are volunteers, white soldiers are conscripted. Capitalist armies are for preserving the capitalist class. The Red Army fights for the proletariat. The militarists' army's work is to collect taxes and squeeze the blood of the people. The Red Army fights to free the people. The masses hate the White Army. They love the Red Army. But how, I interrupted once more, Do you know the peasants really like the Red Army? Again, several jumped up to answer. The political commissar recognized one. When we go into a new district, he said, the peasants always volunteer to help our hospital service. They carry our wounded back to our hospitals from the front. Another. On our long march through Sichuan, the peasants bought us grass shoes made by themselves, and they bought us tea and hot water along the road. A third. When I fought in Liu Jitan's 26th Army in Dingpian, we were a small detachment defending a lonely outpost against the Kuomintang general, Gao Guizi. The peasants brought us food and water. We did not have to use our men to bring supplies. The people helped us. Gao Guizi's men were defeated. We captured some, and they told us they had no water for almost 2 days. The peasants had poisoned the wells and run away. A Gansu peasant soldier. The people help us in many ways. During battles they often disarm small parties of the enemy, cut their telephone and telegraph wires, and send us news about the movements of the white troops, but they never cut our telephone lines. They help us put them up. Another. When an enemy aeroplane crashed against a mountain in Shanxi recently, nobody saw it but a few farmers. They were armed only with spears and spades, but they attacked the aeroplane, disarmed the 2 aviators, arrested them, and brought them to us at Waiyabao. Still another. Last April in Yanchang, 5 villages formed Soviets where I was stationed. Afterwards we were attacked by Tang Empo and had to retreat. The Mintuan returned, arrested 18 villagers and cut off their heads. Then we counterattacked. The villagers led us by a secret mountain path to attack the Mintuan. We took them by surprise, and we attacked and disarmed 3 platoons. One youth with a long scar across his cheek got up and told of some experiences on the long march. When the Red Army was passing through Guizhou, he said, I was wounded with some other comrades near Xunyi. The army had to move on. It could not take us along. The doctors bandaged us and left us with some peasants, asking them to look after us. They fed us and treated us well, and when the white troops came to that village they hid us. In a few weeks we recovered. Later on the Red Army returned to that district and captured Xunyi a second time. We rejoined the army, and some of the young men of the villages went with us. Another. Once we were staying in a village of Anding, North Shanxi, and there were only 12 men and rifles. The peasants there made bean curd for us and gave us a sheep. We had a feast and we ate too much and went to sleep, leaving only one sentry on guard. He went to sleep too. But in the middle of the night a peasant boy arrived and woke us up. He had run 10 li to warn us that the Mintuan were there and intended to surround us. The Mintuan did attack us about an hour later, but we were ready for them and drove them off. A bright-eyed young lad without a shadow of a whisker on his face arose and declared, I have only this to say. When the White Army comes to a village in Gansu, nobody helps it, nobody gives it any food, and nobody wants to join. When the Red Army comes, the peasants organize and form committees to help us, and young men volunteer to join. Our Red Army is the people, and this is what I have to say. Every youth there seemed to have a personal experience to relate to prove that peasants like us. I wrote down 17 different answers to that question. It proved so popular that another hour had passed before I realized that these warriors had been delayed long past their dinner call. I apologized and prepared to leave, but one small devil attached to the company stood up and said, Don't worry about ceremony. We Reds don't care about going without food when we are fighting, and we don't care about missing our food when we can tell a foreign friend about our Red Army.